Oh, thank you, Ben. And my primary gratitude to colleagues, my colleagues who've put up with me for years from Mungo, the Barkindji, Muti Muti and Nyampa, people who are here today. It has been a great, it's been 50 years, a great debt to you and to your people for which we are eternally grateful. So after 50 years, things have changed. Just very briefly, the Mungo man came home, the message from Uluru, we've heard a little about that, and that is a long-term objective. If we can support that message, that's to a very large extent part of the reason why we're here. We've heard briefly from the moment from Bruce Pascoe and his dark emu, which has expanded and completely changed the understanding of the Aboriginal economies, Aboriginal agriculture and the development of those people when Europeans arrived, completely misunderstood in the past. Bruce has brought the dark emu into the schools, into the educational context, and that is one of the great developments in the change that's taken place. And now with the new Aboriginal minister, a new world is open to us. We now face a completely different situation from the one that we've lived through for the last 50 years. So those site values, we have Kakadu with 65,000 years, Uluru, the legendary powerful symbolism and the powerful statement that has been provided in the message from the heart. Moyal, which is the place down near Warrnambool. But these are great sites for contribution of the story of ancient occupation, but it's Lake Mungo with the national and cultural heritage that stands, I think, as the most comprehensive, the most powerful in the educational context of who antiquity, who the ancient occupants were. Mungo, Uluru and Kakadu, three major sites which will all contribute to those educational agendas for the future. But very briefly down here at Warrnambool, where there is the suggestive evidence, for me it's geological evidence on this cliff shoreline, there is the evidence up here of shells cemented into calcrete, obviously of great antiquity. Fire and fire stones. These are hearthstones which are dated 100, 100,000, 93,000. They were used by people, we believe, of times much older than present occupation known in Australia. In summary, that if we put that sequence into context of a sea level curve, changing sea level back from present back to 120,000 years, the Warrnambool evidence down here, here's Kakadu and Mungo in that long period of 120,000 years. Once we accept that these were the product of human agency, that means that people were present throughout that time. Down there at Warrnambool. Now, if they're at Warrnambool 120,000 years, you can imagine where they were, there's a significance for the rest of Australia. But more importantly, that would put the occupation of Australia at a time when people say the first people were coming out of Africa. So this evidence is capable of putting the whole Australian story into a new context of global humanity, global human understanding. Once we appreciate that people were here at a level of African significance, it puts all of these sites into new levels of global significance. So although the Warrnambool evidence might seem to be competing, it's actually compounding and upgrading the evidence from Mungo. The Moyal evidence elevates the story of Australian occupation, I would say, to new levels of global significance, and that impacts on the way in which Mungo is presented to the world. It's not only artefacts, but the Mungo story contains the evidence of people, a story without equal on the planet. So we're here in the centre of the Murray Basin, and the Mungo story is whilst its great cultural significance, has immense natural significance. It is the story of the evolution of the Murray Basin. Here in the Darling River and these dry lakes, once brimful and located at the very centre where rivers meet, the story where Australian environmental history comes together. Over here, we fill these lakes to show the way they were filled, flowing about the time of the Mungo people occupation. And we'll go very briefly to the eastern shoreline of Mungo. Many of you have seen these pictures before. I'll go through them very, very quickly to try to cover some of the substance at the end. Visual landscape of the moon-like landscapes with layered sequence here, where geologically we can map these and date each one of them. We date here Gold back to 120,000 years, and if I'm correct, this is the possibility of human occupation back here at this level, previously unprecedented in the Mungo story. Then we come up to the level of Mungo. That's where the layers of people and lots of artefacts, the display of artefacts. I'm not an archaeologist, so just an immense variety of stone tools, midden shells, bone points. There is no other site in Australia that possesses that rich diversity. The story of human presence, however, is related to the southern part of the Lake Dune, the Lunette. A Mungo lady you've heard before, and that was 50 years ago or 51 years ago when first discovered. It has changed the way in which we understand the occupation of that land. A cross-section through here showing the location of those, the two human remains, Mungo lady and Mungo man, some 5 metres below the original dune surface. So immediately they appeared. I knew they were very, very old. This is the first sign of Mungo lady's bones cemented into that block of soil carbonate with fragments of burnt bone. That block was removed to Canberra, and from those remains, Alan Thorne reconstructed the cranium of what turned out to be the cranium of a fully modern lady, now known everywhere as Mungo Lady, an answer to those who had previously contended, in Britain mainly, that the ancient Indigenous people of Australia were pre-modern human. And whereas this demonstrated for the first time a fully modern human and a great age, at that stage 30,000, which has gone back now to 40,000 years. So that completely changed the nature, the perception, the way Europeans looked upon early Australian Indigenous people. The next discovery, just 400 metres away from Mungo Lady, the remains of Mungo Man. I just saw the tip of the cranium coming out of the ground, and my colleagues came very quickly. It's important to remember that neither of these remains were actually excavated. They came to the surface in the process of natural erosion, and it has been identified by Aboriginal elders, and certainly I associate this with myself, the notion that those remains came to the surface in a spiritual context to inform us much more about ancient occupation and its relevance to who we are today. It's in that context that this story of Mungo Man in particular, and the red ochre which we found staining the top of the cranium, and which was an example of which shown here, a slug of ochre, very rare in that region. It was from the same level as the burial, and you can actually see engraving, grinding platform on that rock, that slug. That had to be imported a long distance away. And here we are 40,000 years ago, people preparing for this ceremonial burial, collecting the ochre and having it ground and available for distribution around the upper part of the body. For me and for Aboriginal people, this is a sacred image, and I present these here today. I wouldn't like to see my grandparents on a screen like this, but we do this in respect to the traditional people who have been informed by the emergence of these ancient representatives to the surface today with their various messages. Now, it's not only the ochre, but also the presence of fire. So we have here an extraordinary conjunction of rituals which would be equivalent to those enacted in any cathedral today. 40,000 years ago, imagine the community planning the burial of this gentleman, bringing together the ochre, the young men preparing the grave, the fire as a part of the ritual, which is consistent, of course, with the present Aboriginal custom of cleansing through fire. So in terms of the age, we can demonstrate that. We can be assured that there was very detailed evidence of dating the sands both below and above the grave to ensure that the age of this is actually confirmed. And that can be, I won't dwell on the science of it too much, but this is a cross-section of the dune. The burial is there, and this is an enlargement part. The dates before 44,000, the dates above 42 and 37. He was bracketed between the 42 and 39,000 years. So we use the date of 41 plus or minus 2, rounded to 40,000 years. And that is an incredible situation to find modern humans at that age with that degree of cultural sophistication. And that I'll just go back for a moment to Mungo Man. The burial context, it denotes a spiritual connection between life, death, and something beyond. That ochre anointing and the fire is connecting this community to the land in which they live. They were connected not only to country, as Aboriginal people remain connected today. These ancient Australians were connected to the cosmos. They had generated their spiritual identity and their cosmology, and it's represented in that ritual celebration of death. A phenomenon of continuously amazing significance. So we'll move on to now the problem I see of where science finds itself in conflict with traditional Aboriginal cultures, and that is the science of we of the Enlightenment. I'm a geologist, and the science of geology and the Darwin evolutionary story we build on, but in so doing we adopt that rationalistic attitude to nature in which we become the masters of nature. We adopt that a commercial mentality where we can dig it up and sell it without any sense of spiritual connection to that land. That is in direct conflict with the tradition of Aboriginal cultures, as we've heard here earlier today. The question of this arose in 50 years ago of who owns Australian history. Now, that was resolved in the sands on the shores of Lake Mungo, where the scientists sat down with the elders, shared their dialogues, and each came to an accommodation. Each came to learn from the other and to realise that we are, in a sense, dependent on each other. And that's part of the great expressions of this assemblage today. They were times of tension, but they were resolved largely by the benevolent attitude of Alice Kelly, in this case, her representatives here with the elders today. Indigenous communities, they claim to reclaim their rights, and that was a moment of great, more than achievement. It was more than reconciliation, but learning that, in a sense, that in an Australian context, we are dependent on each other. Mary Pappen, Alice Kelly's daughter, who is unfortunately not here today, a great debt we owe to Alice for her she was the earliest representative of the Aboriginal people with the scientists. She came here in the early days of national parks in the World Heritage Area, brought the other ladies from the associated tribal groups, the Mati-Mati, the Nyampa and Barkindji, and here with Alice and the late Alice Bugmy, standing on the very site of Mungo Lady. Mungo Lady became something almost of a saintly characteristic in the eyes of Alice and her friends. So, finishing now, coming towards the return of Mungo Man, many will remember Hearst, that was brought from the Melbourne Museum, travelled up to Canberra and out to Lake Mungo, and the association of that with the fireplace and the ritual return of the Mungo Man remains with that smoking fire, the eucalypts, and an expression of extraordinary resonance. The ritual fire with the grave here being reenacted after 40,000 years. No country on earth can claim this extraordinary conjunction of past with present, the continuity of that ritual, and in a context where the shoreline sands express the cultural complexity of these people where land and people are bonded in life as in death. And it's really that conjunction of circumstance that stands as a monumental expression in the world of Mungo's location in the world today. Our privilege is to learn from Australians 40,000 years ago. Their message, what have you done to our land? If we can imagine we are listening to the return of those ancient people today. Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, what have we done? What have you done to our land? And I could only just mention the case of the fish deaths on the Darling River recently. What have you done to our people? These are questions that must be answered in that future centre about which Jason has spoken so eloquently. Across a deep cultural divide, a wound healing process awaits us. Now, where is the nation's wound healing place? We have national war memorials, but as Jason has pointed out, we don't have any memorial centre for the Aboriginal people. What is our Washington Monument? The Washington Monument, of course, commemorates the end of the war. We don't have that place of national healing in Australia. Mungo people have returned to remind us for the essential nature of such a centre. Their voices call us to a healing place, a healing moment where the two cultures meet and acknowledge, each learning from the other, as Jason has so eloquently presented earlier. We need that truth and healing place, somewhere where people can sit down together and exchange items which I feel lead us into a redemptive moment, when we of the West acknowledge a debt. Now, a lot of people are not going to agree with me when I put it this way. It is we of the West, we of the Enlightenment, of the scientific community, of the rational community, which has denigrated indigenous, intuitive understanding of their cosmology. Denigrated. We, however, need to learn from them. I would look forward to the day when we can sit down together and not acknowledge a debt to Aboriginal people where they have the connection to land. And that's a connection that we have lost. It's a connection that we have to be prepared to make. I would see the opportunity of a healing moment when we of the West are prepared to sit down with the elders and say, we need to learn from you. You have something which we have lost. You have your connection to country. We've lost our sense of connection to land, connection to people. You have your cosmology. We have our cosmology. It's written in science. From the Big Bang, mind has emerged from matter. Consciousness. Here we are all sitting together today, listening to each other, except to me when I stuff it up. But our consciousness comes from inanimate matter, comes from cosmic energy. The cosmic energy is embedded in the understanding of the Aboriginal people in there. We call it their mythology. It may be mythology, but it has direct reflection with the manner in which the mystery of consciousness has emerged from matter. So that's a connection we have to find. And we find it by example from the Aboriginal people. Most of my friends, scientific friends, will think I'm talking rubbish. But in a sense of discovering the spiritual connection with the land in which we live and the spiritual connection to the Aboriginal people whom we have so drastically denigrated, that connection lies open, available to us in the future. It is embedded in the notion of Jason's story of a national centre, a centre where land and people, and I stress land, because the story of people, land tells the story of the people. And it's in that conjunction of the natural and the spiritual that we can see in the context of Jason's proposal for a national centre at Lake Mungo is one in which Australia awaits that monument, a definition of cultural integrity, of cultural conjunction, the bridge between cultures when both recognises and learns from the other and provides a much greater understanding of what it means to be Australian.